the Tet Offensive made the wind change in the U.S. In late January 1968, the Americans thought their army would win in South Vietnam after 3 years of escalation. But then, the general offensive and uprising campaign of the Tet Offensive dealt a blow to American public support for the army, leading to the U.S. having to accept the withdrawal of its troops and the evacuation of its own people. By the end of January 1968, American troops had directly participated in the war in Vietnam for nearly 3 years. However, this is part of a longer war since World War II. When the first U.S. Marines landed in March 1965, most of the towns and hamlets were under the control of the National Front for the Liberation of South Vietnam, while the Vietnamese government, the Republic, is on the verge of collapse. The U.S. military intends to establish a series of bases throughout the South, push the liberators out of the safe bases and assist the Republic of Vietnam forces to regain the initiative. At that time, General William C. Westmoreland assured American politicians and the press that the situation on the ground was progressing and that the United States could win this war. By the end of 1968, the U.S. had sent 485,000 troops into South Vietnam and controlled 2/3 of the cities in the South. At that time, the U.S. estimated the number of the Liberation Army of South Vietnam only about 220,000. The U.S. assessed that the recruitment of the South Vietnamese Liberation Army in the villages was declining, while the force moving from the north along the Ho Chi Minh Trail also decreased significantly. Although American public opinion was already war-weary, the military promised progress on the battlefield, and General Westmoreland predicted the war would end in 1970. However, progress must be maintained. Otherwise public opinion and politicians would lose faith in such predictions. In November 1967, Westmoreland announced the war had entered a new phase. Many newspapers supported this view, and politicians and public opinion were appeased. However, Hanoi thought differently, planning counterattacks against multiple targets throughout the South. The Liberation Army infiltrated cities and towns before launching a massive assault on government headquarters and military bases. Military action is the first step, the catalyst to wage a people's war and overthrow the government in the South. The plan began by hitting Khe Sanh, causing the U.S. military to eventually give up this important military base. Before Tet 1968, the U.S. and the government of the Republic of Vietnam knew that the South Vietnamese Liberation Army planned to attack on this occasion, but did not know where the attack would take place. They were also unaware of the power this general offensive was about to produce. After January 20, when the West was still talking about the Khe Sanh base near the demilitarized zone, tens of thousands of the South Vietnamese Liberation Army and the North Vietnamese Army silently moved to positions throughout cities and towns. Commune, prepare weapons to wait for orders. On January 30, the first day of Tet, the liberation forces simultaneously attacked dozens of targets across the South, including government headquarters, military bases, and other targets. In the days that followed, the whole world watched the war on television as American and Allied forces in the South attempted to regain control of cities and towns. According to the West, the biggest damage to Washington after this general offensive is the decrease in support from American public opinion. In those fateful days, politicians in Washington, D.C. and Americans lost faith in the military. General Westmoreland predicted the end of the day, but not in the way he wanted. After the general offensive, Westmoreland was replaced by General Creighton W. Abrams. U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson retired from the White House after receiving poor results in the primaries, only to be replaced by Richard Nixon, who made a promise to achieve peace with honor in the war in Vietnam. That promise was made not long after the U.S. had to withdraw its troops from the South. The last group of American troops had to leave South Vietnam in June 1972, but the war continued for another 3 years. In the spring of 1975, the Liberation Army continued to launch another attack, starting on March 10. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam was soon overwhelmed. On April 29 of that year, President Gerald Ford ordered Operation Whirlwind to evacuate their people from the American embassy in Saigon. Then came tumultuous days as American helicopters rushed to and from the embassy, while tanks of the Liberation Army swarmed the streets of the city.